Trace here, right? I saw it.
Yes.
Exactly. All right, work is up. Everybody have good Thanksgiving?
Yes.
Lots of turkey? Lots of studying? Absolutely. Guys, oh, wait until your teachers. When people talk, you should talk back.
How was your Thanksgiving, Dr. Roll?
My Thanksgiving was lovely, thank you very much. Bit of a hike back on Saturday.
What are you doing?
London.
Oh.
It was near 20 hours to get back on Saturday. But it was worth it. All right, so last lecture. Okay, this is the last one, Thursday. Thursday will be the review session, all right, for next week's final exam. The last exam is not cumulative, it's just on the work that we've done since the last exam, okay? So, all right, so we're going to just look at a couple more ideas around learning and some of the issues that are have to be faced by teachers and coaches who are trying to assess learning. Right? So, motor behavior, at the beginning of the semester I said motor behavior is the umbrella term, and under that we have motor development that we've spent most of the semester on, motor learning and motor control. Motor learning is looking at what's going on in the brain when you practice or you gain experience at something that leads to a change in the performance at that task. Right? So what do we know? What can we tell? How is the brain learning a new skill? How can we facilitate learning a new skill? Because teaching can be a very negative experience for learning if it's not done well, right? You can actually stop the brain from learning the thing that you're trying to get across if you don't do it very well. So we have to pay attention to the fact that motor learning, what we're measuring is not because of growth. So for example, if we're looking at free throw shots, right, then if I grow, if I get taller, chances are I'll score better out of 10 attempts at a free throw, right? Just because I'm closer to the basket, I've got a better chance of making the basket. That's not learning, right? That's just, I got taller, okay? So we have to be able to distinguish between the two. So performance then is the thing we can see, right? When I'm watching someone do a skill, then I'm watching the performance. I can measure their performance, I can assess their performance. I can't see learning, right? So we have to, because learning is an abstract thing that's going on inside the brain. I can't see it. I have to infer that learning is occurring based upon what I'm seeing with the performance. So some of the characteristics that I would expect if someone is learning a skill, all right, most obvious one is performance should get better, right? I should see an improvement depending on what it is I'm measuring, right? What kind of improvement am I looking for? Do I see improved biomechanics? Do I see better force production? Do I see better outcomes? Do I see more successful attempts at the skill? What is it that I'm measuring that I can tell is getting better? The performance should get more consistent, so the person should be able to replicate that skill over and over and over. Right? And it should be relatively permanent, so I would expect it after the summer break for them to come back and still be able to do the skill. And hopefully, depending again on the type of skill that you're looking at, it's going to be relatively adaptable. So if it's an open skill, right, on that closed open continuum that we discussed before Thanksgiving, if it's an open skill and it's in a team game, the more adaptable the skill is, the better off we are, the more choices we've got as a team to play that shot. Right? So how can we know, as the teacher, how can we know whether or not learning is going on, whether the brain is actually learning the skill? One way is to do performance observations. So I can measure the performance over time, plot it, and I can see that performance is getting better. Right? It's a relatively tedious way of doing it. Means I've got to run a lot of assessments, but it would do the trick. Okay. Then another option we have is something that we call a retention test. And retention is the persistence of the skill over time. So if I have a period of time without any practice at that skill, what happens? So how many of you can ride a bike? Okay, when did you learn to ride the bike? When you were little, right? If you don't have your bike with you at school and you go home, do you expect to be able to ride the bike when you go home? Or do you think you're going to fall off? You expect to be able to ride the bike, right? Even though you haven't ridden it for 10 years or, right? So that's retention. What do I see happen when we don't do the skill for a while? Transfer tests are really what we do every day, right? We practice in one particular environment, in one context, and then we go and compete in a completely different context. So we have to be able to do the skill that we were practicing in the competition as well, right? But we change the environment, we change the amount of pressure that we're under, right? What happens when we transfer the skill from training into the real deal? Okay. So what we're looking at then when we're using transfer tests and retention tests is a learning versus a performance effect. Right? So a learning effect is relatively permanent. Performance effects are temporary. So if we look at sprinting, right, whether it's in a pool or on a track, most personal bests, I think, yell at me, Darren, if I'm completely wrong, but generally a PB is set in a competition situation. Okay? Because with the crowd, with the adrenaline, with the motivation, all those things lead you to run just that little bit faster and get a PB. Okay? It's very difficult to replicate that PB under training situations. You don't do a personal best every time you run 100 meters or 200 meters. It occurs once in a blue moon, right? So a personal best is typically a performance effect. It might be based upon the training that you've been doing, right? So the training allowed you to achieve the PB, but under what circumstances do you do the PB and how do you do it again, right? So that's what you want to be thinking about there. So what we want to be able to do then when we're teaching the skill is I want to be able to tell the difference between a performance effect and an actual learning effect. It's one of the problems, I think, with the TGMD with the little children is how do I know that what they're doing is really something they've learned rather than something they're doing just because they want to play with me. Because they're so young, it's difficult to tease that out sometimes, right? As you use the TGMD with slightly older children, then it's very obvious that what you're measuring is a performance increase over time, right? But sometimes with the little ones, on your pre-test, were they having an off day, right? It's difficult with a 3-year-old to know that the measure you got was the true measure. It would be better if we did it several times and averaged it, but we don't have the time to do that. So, we're going to use a retention or a transfer test. Now, when you look at the picture of a retention test, then what we get is, this is performance, and this is time, okay? And I introduce a brand new skill. Then, as they practice the skill, so in our PE class, I give them a new thing to do, and I set up some different activities for them to practice this skill. And I would expect performance on the skill to go up over time. Even for someone who's not very good at the skill, doesn't have the right mix of abilities to be great at the skill, if they're practicing the skill, then we should see performance go up in some respect, right? And then we take a break from that skill. So I change my lesson unit and I introduce a new skill, right? And then maybe at the end of the semester, we have another go at all the skills that we tried during the semester, right? So after a break in time, we're going to try this skill again. So here is the key. What happens after the break? If what happens after the break is this, we've got a problem, because that means that all that improvement in performance didn't equate to learning. It was just a practice effect of doing the skill over and over again. But I didn't give them enough practice for the brain to actually learn the skill, because then when I test it, we're back to square one, right? If, however, what I get is anything above here, so if I get maybe this, right? It's a bit of a drop, but it didn't go back to square one. So this would indicate that some learning occurred, but that really I didn't give them enough practice on it the first time around, because they didn't completely come back at where we had left off, right? Ideally, what you want is after the break, we get that, right? That there's no drop in performance over time, right? That indicates good learning. The break may just be the weekend, right? If I'm coaching a team and I teach them something during the week and then I don't get to play with them over the weekend and they come back Monday, what happens on Monday, right? How much time do I have to spend going over the work that we did the previous week, or can I introduce a new skill now? Right? So retention tests are very useful. And you don't necessarily have to do a formal assessment, just get them to try the skill again and see what happens. So if they flat, it's not learned yet. We have to do a lot more work on that skill. The transfer test is really looking at the stability of the skill, particularly when we put it into a stressful situation. So in gymnastics, this used to happen a lot. We'd learn a new skill in the gym, and we'd practice it, and it was going pretty well. And we had a competition coming up, and so we would put the skill into the routine for the competition, and then in the competition, the gymnast lands on her face on the mat. Because really, we hadn't done enough practice to risk putting that skill into the routine. It wasn't grooved enough. So when I stress it in the competition, it fell apart and she lands on her face. Right? Again, we do that a lot as coaches, less as PE teachers, because we don't have to stress the skill in PE. But as a coach, I want to learn a new pattern of play, right? And we practice this pattern of play quite a lot, and I think, okay, the team we're going up against this weekend, this pattern of play will be pretty successful. I'm going to tell them to run that pattern. And then when they try to run that pattern, it all goes ugly and kaplooey and very nasty, and I'm standing on the sidelines going berserk because they didn't do what I told them to do. Well, maybe you shouldn't have told them to use it yet, because they hadn't practiced it enough. When they transferred it, it fell apart. It wasn't ready. Okay? So what happens to the skill under stress when it goes wrong in the game? Whose fault is it really? Is it your fault as the coach, or is it the player's fault? Because honestly, how often is a player out on the field not giving 100%? Right? Not very often, really. I mean, maybe they're giving 98%, but I mean, are they giving 20%? Why did it not work? Because it's not, you can't say they didn't try. That's daft. That's daft, right? If the coach is, if you come off the field and your coach is going, well, why didn't you try harder? What does that mean? So maybe you were trying the wrong skill. You shouldn't have put it in the game then. So we have a developmental aspect to learning, and one of the most widely used models for how we learn is a relatively simple one by some authors called Fitz and Posner. You can see that it's pretty old now, but it is still used and discussed in the literature all the time. There's a couple of other models that you see quite often, but everybody knows Fitz and Posner, so it's a very good place to start on learning how the development of learning occurs. So their model had 3 stages in it. Stage 1, the cognitive stage, is the initial introduction of the skill, and the beginner is looking, really focusing on cognitive problems to do with the skill. Right? So if I look at throwing, then when I introduce throwing, right, they're looking at how do I get the ball far enough away. If I'm trying to get them to step, right, do they have to look? What are they doing while they're being introduced to the new skill? Right? So we should see a distinct change then as they transition into stage 2. Stage 2 is called the associative stage, and it's the point at which they start to feel relatively comfortable with the skill, and they might be able, as they move through stage 2, to start paying attention to some relatively simple environmental cues. And then, if we get enough practice and we're lucky enough, we're going to transition into the autonomous stage, stage 3. And the autonomous stage is the point at which that skill is automatic, right? So as skilled athletes, most of the skills that you use are pretty automatic. You don't have to think about the movement. You can look around the field and decide what you have to do and what's appropriate for that situation, right? And it's more a continuum. We discuss them as step 1, step 2, step 3, just like we do with our skill development stages, but really it's a blending, right? I move through stage 1 into stage 2. There's a little bit of overlap. When we're at the overlap, then we can we see some variability between stage 1 and stage 2. Then we move into stage 2. We move through stage 2. If we get enough practice, we might get into stage 3. So in stage 1, the learner, the brain's trying to understand what's the goal of the skill, right? What am I trying to do here? Okay. And so the brain starts to build a cognitive map of what's required to do this skill, right? A strategy. Typically, performance is poor. It's very variable. They might do it well one time and then do it really badly the next time, right? There's a lot of very big errors going on mechanically in the skill. It's not very good, right? The individual's having to pay a lot of attention to actually doing the skill. So when I throw, I have to remind myself quite often to step with the opposite foot. So as a thrower, I'm probably still cognitive because I don't just automatic. My automatic would be stepping with the wrong foot. Right? Okay. And then primarily, someone who's in the cognitive stage is performing that skill under visual control. So they might actually look at their feet. If you watch someone playing the piano who's a beginner, right? They're looking at their fingers as they hit the piano keys. Well, a really good piano player doesn't look at the keyboard, right? Same with you guys when you text, right? When I text, I have to look. You guys will sit there and flip around, okay? So are they having to think about what they're doing? So if I'm teaching that, if you're teaching someone who's clearly at the cognitive stage on this particular skill, and we're using Fitz and Posner for movement skills, but that's the model stages of learning applies to all learning. So it applies to your academic learning, learning on a job that you're doing, anything, right? Learning is learning. Doesn't matter which domain it is. We do it the same way, okay? So if I'm teaching that, I should introduce the skill briefly. You don't want to spend too much time and give them too much detail. They're not ready to know all that, right? This is what they need to know to have a go at the skill. Demonstrate. So visual modeling is very important for a beginner. And some explanation of what they're trying to do. Then give them practice time, and then you need to be thinking about what kind of feedback are you going to give this beginner, right? You don't want to give them feedback on 5 errors at the same time. probably only on one or two. You want to pick the areas that are the largest and work backwards. So what's the most important thing that needs changing on this skill? Let's tackle that, and then once we've got that changed, then I can tackle the next problem. Right? Don't chuck loads and loads of information at them at one time, because that won't work. The brain doesn't understand the skill well enough yet. Right? So cognitive stage can last for just a couple of attempts at the skill. It can last weeks and weeks and weeks. So when we're throwing, if you've got someone who goes from throwing like this to throwing like this in one lesson, then they went through that cognitive stage very quickly. You could have someone that sticks in stage 3 of throwing for weeks. It could take you weeks as the teacher to get them to switch to stepping in opposition without having to think about it. So you can't expect everybody in the class. It's a highly individual concept. Right? I've got to allow that all my learners are going to learn at their own speed. So I'm going to see different things happen with different people. If we get through then that cognitive stage into the associative stage for this skill, whatever this skill is, then that's where we do most of the practice. Like this is the repeat, repeat, repeat. You know, tell me what you're doing. Can you explain what you're doing? Do you understand what you're doing wrong? Let's do it again. Let's keep going. Let's see if we can get this to be relatively consistent. All right? So when I'm teaching someone who's in the associative stage, then I've got to plan a really good practice activity. Right? What different stations am I going to set up in the gym that will help them practice this skill? So that's where most of my time then as the teacher becomes setting up appropriate developmental practice for them to do this skill. Right? And starting to get them to recognize errors for themselves, because ultimately, if I'm a good teacher, I should do myself out of the job. Right? I shouldn't have to give them feedback. They should do the skill and turn around at me and go, oh, I didn't take a long enough step. Right? I shouldn't have to tell them that. So with proper practice setups and good feedback and good cues so that they know what they're starting to look for, then the brain's cognitive map of the skill becomes much better developed. They're able to identify errors for themselves. Yes, sir?
For like throwing, would this stage be like hitting targets and stuff like that? Or would it still be just on like the footwork of it, or is it all of that?
If we're looking at fundamental throwing, you would probably still be working on making sure that they're stepping with the opposite foot initially, and then as they're moving through, you could start throwing harder or throwing softer and teaching them different arm actions for the required outcome for the skill. So here, then, the requirement for cognitive attention starts to reduce. Right? I don't have to pay so much when I'm here now. I don't have to think, okay, step in opposition. Because I'm stepping in opposition most of the time. I can start thinking about, oh, what's my arm doing? So, they're going to attend as they move through stage 2. They're going to start to attend less and less to the physical execution of the skill. And they'll be able to identify errors for themselves. Okay. and the skill will start to become more consistent. It will get faster if that's appropriate for the skill. The coordination will become smoother during the skill. And what we're aiming for during the associative stage, if it's a closed skill, so remember a closed skill is one where the environment is very similar every time I do it. Right? In a closed skill, what I want is for the skill to become pretty consistent. Right? So if I'm doing a cartwheel, I want the cartwheel to look the same every time they do the cartwheel. Right? If it's an open skill, then what I'm looking for during the associative stage is that it can start to become a little more flexible, right? Because I want them to be able to use it in lots of different contexts. So what I'm looking for as the individual's learning the skill somewhat depends upon what type of skill we classified it as in the first place. So performance would be improving in this stage. It wouldn't necessarily be proficient or really, really good, but it would be adequate and it would be repeatable as they move through this stage. So the final, the autonomous learning stage, is the one where you have to have had a lot of practice and experience with this skill. Right? Lots and lots of practice. So on many, many skills, most people don't get to the autonomous stage. Okay? So if you guys can consider the skills that you do every day for your sport that you're competing in, you're in the autonomous stage for those skills, right? But if I ask you to gallop down the hallway, right, are you in the cognitive stage or the associative stage? Because most of you don't have enough practice at galloping to really be autonomous at galloping. So it's not a global thing, it's skill specific. And that's important to remember. Just because they're really good at this doesn't mean they're really good at every aspect to do with putting the whole game together. Right? So getting to autonomy, getting to that autonomous stage is a lot of work. So at this point, their understanding of the skill is excellent. They know what the skill is supposed to look like. They know what the mechanics would be. They're very good at recognizing their own problems with the skill, if there are any. Right? The cognitive map is very highly developed. What we're spending time on in this stage is tweaking, fine-tuning little things that will improve the mechanics even more. Right? The sequence is very automatic. I don't have to think about it at all. It just happens. Right? So driving, for most of us, is relatively autonomous. We get a lot of practice. We do it several times a day. Okay? So if I'm using a manual and I've got a gear stick, I don't have to think about what is my hand doing, where's the next, right? It just happens. Sometimes we don't even think about changing gear because we do it based on the sound of the engine. And I automatically change gear based on what the engine sounds like, right? So very, very much in this stage, you're able to start paying attention to what's going on around you while you're doing the skill, if that's relevant. Right? In my gymnastics, I don't want them paying attention to what's going on around. I want them doing all their focus here. So it depends on the skill. So I don't have to concentrate on technique now. I can look around and look at what other stimuli are going on in the environment, if that's relevant. Okay? If it's a closed skill, it's going to become very consistent. It's going to look very similar every time we do it. Open skills are going to become more diversified, more flexible. Right? So what do I do now as the teacher? Right? If I'm the teacher and we've moved the person through to the autonomous stage, now my job is to maintain the skill. Right? So I have to set up the appropriate practice to maintain the skill and just tweak it a little bit. The biggest job you have with students who are in the autonomous stage is motivating them to keep practicing, because everybody over time loses some performance, right, if we don't practice. But if I'm really, really good at something, sometimes practicing it gets a bit boring, or it can feel unnecessary, right? Why do I need to do this? I can already do it. Well, you can already do it now, but next year you need to still be able to already do it, right? So we have to keep practicing. We have to keep maintain your skill level at that high degree of mechanics. Okay? So motivating the athlete becomes crucial here, because I need them to come to practice every day and do the same thing. Can I come up with a different set of exercises that will have the same outcome, but it feels like I'm doing something different, so it's not so boring? I had a friend who was a swimmer, and she said she has the most ridiculous kind of fantasy life going in her head a lot of the time, because when you swim up and down a pool for hours on end and you're just staring at the bottom of the pool, you have to come up with all these kind of games that you play. Okay? So if I'm coaching, how do I motivate someone to swim up and down for hours on end? What do I do? So ultimately, for many of us, not everybody, but for many, particularly people who want to compete at a particular sport, then what we are aiming for is to become expert at that sport. And to become an expert, you have to have optimal instruction, you have to have intense practice on a regular basis, often hours a day. Right? You've got to have personalized training programs and personalized instruction. Right? So it has to involve a really good, knowledgeable coach to become expert at a particular skill. And what the research shows us is that to become expert takes 10 years or 10,000 hours of intense, deliberate practice. So going out to play golf once even if you just go once a week and play a round of golf on a Saturday, that's not going to make you expert. Right? To be expert, you've got to go out and practice golf, putting, your swing, every day. For hours. Right? So 10 years, 10,000 hours. So again, you guys think about how long have you been doing your sport? Those of you that are competing, NCAA Division II, that's pretty good. Right? You are pretty good at what you do. So how long have you been doing it? What made you pretty good? Right? Most people, it's highly unusual. There's always the person that breaks the rule, right? There's always going to be someone who became really, really good at something in 5 years. Right? But it's very, very unusual. Expertise is domain specific. So Just because I'm expert in one thing does not mean I'm expert at all things. Okay. So even if you look at two sports that are quite similar, I'm not going to be expert in both of those sports. Becoming an expert takes heaps and heaps of time. I don't have time to become expert in more than one thing at any one time. Okay? So, generally, there's a little bit of transfer from expertise, the field that I'm good at, to another field that's similar, but there wouldn't be very much transfer to another field that's is distinctly different. Right? The knowledge structure that I build in my sport might transfer a little bit over to another sport, even if the actual mechanics of the skill are very different. So if I play a team game, then my understanding of strategies between teammates might transfer to another team game, even if the actual skill set is very different, right? So that might help me learn the other game a little bit quicker. And when we look at transfer, we have 3 different types of transfer. The first one is positive transfer. So positive transfer means that my previous experience facilitates learning the new skill, right? Facilitates the performance of the skill in a new context or learning a new skill that's similar. So if I'm practicing pitching a particular skill, then we would see positive transfer of that into the game, hopefully. Right? That would be the goal. Some of your weight training exercises will positively transfer to your rehab if you have an injury, because some of the exercises they use in rehab are similar to some of the work that you do in the weight room, right? Some of them are very different. So positive transfer can be very useful and speed up the learning of a new skill if we can work that out. Negative transfer, on the other hand, means that your previous experience hinders learning the new skill or the performance of the new skill. It interferes with it. So what we see is that if, for example, you decide to do a unit on forehands rather than a unit on tennis, right? Well, I can play a forehand in tennis, I can play a forehand in badminton, I can play a forehand in racquetball or squash, right? There's lots of different sports where a forehand is part of the game. But actually what we see is if you teach your PE students how to hit a tennis forehand, and then you take them in the gym and you try to teach them how to play a badminton forehand, those two things are different enough that you'll see some negative transfer. So my husband does racquetball and tennis, and he gets really frustrated because if he's playing a lot of racquetball and then he decides to go play tennis, his tennis game is all over the place. And in his head it shouldn't make any difference because they're both racket sports, but actually the difference between racquetball and tennis is such that it messes up the timing of your swing, and where you've got to have the racket, how much force you have to hold the racket with, are all quite different. So there's some negative transfer there. Right? Third version of transfer is zero, which seems obvious. it's a little bit silly, but you will see it in some of the literature. Previous experience has absolutely no impact at all, good or bad, on the skill that we're going to do. So all my swimming in the pool doesn't affect whether or not I can drive the car home after I've been swimming. Right, that one's a little bit dull, but you do see it occasionally. All right? So, that's learning, right? The take-home picture with learning is that you just have to be really careful. It's very tempting when you're teaching someone a skill and they're starting to get better at it to then move on to another skill, right? Because I see improvement. And I assume that means they've learned that skill and I can change over to something else. You've got to be careful that you don't switch skills too soon, or that you don't stop practicing, introduce another skill, but don't stop practicing the one that you've just learned. Make sure they've learned it before you stop practicing it, right? Because it is tempting to get carried away with, oh yeah, they can do that now, okay, let's do the next thing. Start sticking them together. Well, when you stick them together and you stress the first one, it might go away. And then you get frustrated as the teacher. So you need to understand how that learning sequence occurs so that you introduce the next part of the skill at the appropriate time. Right? Okay. That's it. We are